For over a century, the world has chased a phantom, but a highly controversial historical theory exposes Lord Randolph Churchill as the true mastermind of Jack the Ripper. He allegedly orchestrated bloody Masonic rituals to protect the crown, leaving behind a trail of terrifying evidence, secrets his own son Winston Churchill would later burn to bury forever. In the late 19th century, Lord Randolph Churchill was the absolute center of gravity in British politics. He served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was the leader of the House of Commons. He carried the bloodline of the Dukes of Marlborough, one of the most prestigious families in the empire. In the rigid, unbreakable class system of Victorian England, he was completely untouchable. He possessed a political intellect that allowed him to manipulate the British Parliament with absolute mastery. But power in the Victorian era required massive capital. The Churchill estate held ancient titles, but it severely lacked cash. Lord Randolph required immense funding to drive his towering political ambitions forward. In 1874, he married Jenny Jerome. She was the daughter of an American billionaire. The public press heralded their union as a grand transatlantic romance. Many historians, however, view it through a much colder, more pragmatic lens. It was a classic transaction. It was a ruthless business deal wrapped in aristocratic tradition. Randolph desperately needed Jenny's vast American fortune to fund his campaigns and maintain his lifestyle. Jenny and her highly ambitious father needed the Churchill title to buy their way into the exclusive upper echelons of European high society. The transaction was successful. The facade of the happy, powerful family was established. However, that facade crumbled almost immediately behind closed doors. Shortly after the birth of their first son, Winston Churchill, the heavy oak doors of Lord Randolph's private chambers were permanently closed to his wife. He banished her first from his personal life. He spent his time traveling, organizing political maneuvers, and engaging in a life entirely separated from his family. The British public was led to believe that the heavy burdens of statecraft kept him away from his home. But in the private, smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs of London, a different reality was quietly discussed. The physical desires of Lord Randolph Churchill, some records suggest, were simply not directed toward women. Victorian London operated as a city of two completely separate realities. By day, it was the moral center of the civilized world. It preached temperance, religious purity, and strict family values. By night, it was a sprawling, unregulated market of suppressed human desires. Lord Randolph Churchill lived aggressively within this double life. While he stood at the dispatch box in Westminster, lecturing the nation on conservative values and moral fortitude, his nights offered a different pursuit. Certain alternative historical accounts paint a very specific picture of his hidden life. He did not seek the discreet company of aristocratic mistresses. Instead, it is alleged he ventured deep into the dangerous, undocumented underworld of London. He carried a specific preference. In the shadows, it was known as a taste for rough trade. He allegedly utilized his wife's fortune to solicit vulnerable men. He sought out destitute youths, off-duty soldiers, and individuals living in the extreme poverty of the city. He engaged in highly dangerous, reckless behavior in the dark, unpoliced corners of a society that legally condemned such acts with hard labor and imprisonment. It was a volatile game of power and absolute risk, played out far beneath the polished floors of his public life. But the underworld of the 19th century demanded a physical toll. In an era long before the discovery of antibiotics, reckless indulgence carried an absolute death sentence. According to widespread rumors and alternative historical accounts, These eternal excursions carried a fatal price: syphilis. While modern medical historians actively debate whether his subsequent collapse was caused by neurosyphilis or a brain tumor, the conspiracy theory relies heavily on the former. Syphilis, left untreated, does not simply damage the body. It eventually advances to its tertiary stage. The bacteria penetrate the blood-brain barrier. They slowly devour the central nervous system. This condition is known medically as neurosyphilis, or general paralysis of the insane. The psychological degradation of this condition is severe. As the disease attacks the frontal lobe, the patient systematically loses all sense of human empathy, moral reasoning, and impulse control. It breeds deep paranoia. Most importantly, it induces megalomania. The patient develops a delusional, unshakable belief in their own absolute power and divinity. This disease was slowly rewiring Lord Randolph's brain. It was stripping away his humanity and replacing it with erratic, ruthless paranoia. And this mental decay was happening at the exact moment the British Crown found itself facing the greatest scandal in its modern history. While Lord Randolph's mind was quietly deteriorating behind closed doors, a far more visible and catastrophic threat was brewing within the British royal family itself. This threat did not originate from political adversaries in Parliament or foreign powers across the continent. It centered entirely on Prince Albert Victor, the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria. Known to his family and the public as Prince Eddie, he was second in line to the British throne. Historical records indicate that Prince Eddie was a highly problematic figure for the crown. Tutors consistently found him academically slow and unfocused. Courtiers noted a dangerous lethargy in his demeanor, a stark contrast to the rigid discipline expected of a future monarch. More alarmingly, rumors constantly circulated regarding his private life and his associations. In 1889, these rumors materialized into a severe crisis known as the Cleveland Street Scandal. Metropolitan Police raided a male brothel operating at 19 Cleveland Street in London's West End. The establishment was discovered to be servicing high-ranking aristocratic gentlemen. Panic swept through the highest ranks of the British government when testimony from telegraph boys implicated Prince Eddie as a regular client. The establishment immediately closed ranks. The Crown and the government colluded to suppress the prince's involvement, effectively shielding him from public prosecution. Later events, like the 1889 Cleveland Street Scandal, would officially expose the Crown's willingness to protect Prince Eddie from criminal prosecution at any cost. But theorists argue this protective machinery was already fully operational a year earlier, in the blood-soaked autumn of 1888. The narrative suggests his secret excursions took him far beyond the discreet, heavily guarded, aristocratic brothels of the West End. He allegedly ventured deep into the slums of the East End, specifically into the impoverished labyrinth of Whitechapel. Here, the theory introduces a woman named Annie Crook. She was not a member of the aristocracy. She was a working-class Catholic shopgirl. Some researchers suggest that Prince Eddie, adopting a false identity, formed a relationship with her. The theory claims this relationship escalated far beyond a brief encounter, resulting in a secret marriage and the birth of a royal child, a daughter named Alice Margaret Crook. This alleged event was not merely a royal scandal, it was a constitutional crisis of the highest order. Under the Act of Settlement of 1701, any member of the British royal family who married a Catholic automatically forfeited their place in the line of succession. Furthermore, the existence of a legitimate royal heir born into absolute poverty in the East End threatened to completely destabilize the monarchy. Anti-monarchist sentiment was already simmering in Britain, fueled by severe economic inequality and brutal working conditions. News of a Catholic royal child born in the slums could have easily sparked a revolution, mirroring the violent uprisings that had toppled other European monarchies. The secret had to be contained immediately. According to the theory, the royal family swiftly and ruthlessly separated Prince Eddie from Annie Crook. Annie was reportedly institutionalized, declared mentally unstable, and effectively silenced for the rest of her life. However, a secret of that magnitude could not be easily buried in the densely populated, gossip-fueled slums of Whitechapel. The theory states that a small group of women became aware of the secret marriage and the existence of the royal child. These women were acquaintances of Annie Crook. History remembers their names as Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Mary Jane Kelly. These women lived in absolute destitution. They survived through sporadic, grueling labor and prostitution. Facing starvation, rampant disease, and the brutal approaching winter of 1888, they made a fatal miscalculation. Armed with the knowledge of the royal indiscretion, they attempted to blackmail the British government. Imagine the absolute panic that must have gripped Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria was acutely aware of the fragility of her empire's image. The British crown could not afford a public scandal involving a secret Catholic marriage, an institutionalized mother, and a blackmailed prince. The situation required immediate, decisive, and entirely extrajudicial intervention. The crown needed a solution that would permanently silence the threat without leaving a single trace of government involvement. They needed a fixer who operated above the law. They required a man with unquestionable authority, absolute loyalty to the establishment, and the intellectual capacity to orchestrate a complex, foolproof cover-up. The theory posits that they turned to the highest EC Helens of the government. They turned to Lord Randolph Churchill. This is the critical juncture where medical history and conspiracy theory violently intersect. The crown required a ruthless political maneuver, but Lord Randolph Churchill, suffering from the advancing stages of neurosyphilis, was no longer operating as a rational, calculated statesman. The disease was systematically destroying his capacity for human empathy and moral proportion. The megalomania induced by the bacterial infection convinced him that he possessed the absolute right to exercise life and death over the citizens of the empire. He did not view the blackmailers as desperate women seeking survival in a broken economic system. In his deteriorating paranoid mind, they were a direct infection threatening the body of the state, an infection that required immediate excision. A healthy politician might have arranged for the women to be paid off, imprisoned on false charges, or quietly deported to a distant colony. But Lord Randolph's decaying neural pathways dictated a very different response. He deemed that simple silencing was insufficient. He required a solution that would serve as a permanent, terrifying deterrent, a display of power so absolute that no one would ever dare challenge the crown again. He utilized his immense political power to form a shadow council. He needed operatives who were entirely bound by absolute secrecy and unshakable loyalty. As a high-ranking Freemason, some theorists suggest he turned to the extreme blood-bound oaths of his brotherhood to enforce silence and compliance among his conspirators. He did not intend to execute the women himself. A man of his station orchestrates. He does not perform the physical labor of murder. He required an assassin who could move through the city unquestioned, possessing the anatomical knowledge to execute the killings precisely, and the social authority to avoid police interference. To find this assassin, Lord Randolph allegedly did not look to the criminal underworld. He looked back into the halls of the royal household. He turned to another prominent Freemason, a man of impeccable reputation, immense wealth, and chilling clinical detachment. He recruited Sir William Gull, the brilliant, aging physician in ordinary, to Queen Victoria herself. Sir William Withigull was not a man of the alleys. He was a man of supreme scientific authority. Born into modest circumstances, he had clawed his way to the absolute pinnacle of Victorian medicine through relentless intellect and rigid discipline. By 1888, he was 71 years old. He had famously saved the life of the Prince of Wales during a severe bout of typhoid fever in 1871, securing an unbreakable bond with the royal family. Queen Victoria trusted him implicitly. He was a man who understood the heavy machinery of the empire, and he was deeply embedded in its most secretive networks as a prominent Freemason. Historical records show that Gull had recently suffered a minor stroke, leading to a subtle cognitive decline. Proponents of the royal conspiracy theory argue that this neurological vulnerability, combined with an absolute lifelong devotion to the crown and strict adherence to Masonic obedience, made him the perfect instrument for Lord Randolph Churchill. Gull was allegedly approached not as a murderer, but as a surgeon called upon to perform a necessary, albeit gruesome, amputation to save the body of the state. He was tasked with excising the blackmailers, executing a series of murders in the densely populated slums of Whitechapel, required logistical precision. A prominent gentleman carrying a medical bag could not simply walk the bloody streets unnoticed. The narrative suggests that Gull utilized a closed carriage driven by a trusted accomplice, often identified in these theories as a coachman named John Netley. In the late 19th century, the sight of a wealthy man's carriage in the East End was not unusual. It was the standard method for AIFE, fluent gentlemen seeking illicit nighttime activities. To the local beat constables of the Metropolitan Police, a carriage bearing the subtle marks of high society, or perhaps even royal privilege, was practically invisible. It was not to be stopped, and it was certainly not to be searched. In the late summer of 1888, the surgical strikes began. On August 31st, Mary Ann Nichols was found dead in Bucks Row. Mainstream history often categorizes her as the first victim of a frenzied, sexually motivated serial killer. But analyzing the crime scene through the lens of this theory reveals a different mechanism at work. The attack was swift, silent, and clinically efficient. Her throat was severed with 2 deep cuts, moving from left to right. There was no sign of a struggle. It was an execution. Just over a week later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The violence had escalated, shifting from mere execution to profound mutilation. The killer had meticulously removed her uterus. In the context of the royal cover-up theory, this specific surgical removal was not the act of a random madman, but a highly targeted symbolic warning. It was a brutal statement regarding childbirth, aimed directly at the women who possessed the secret of Prince Eddie's illegitimate royal child. The terror reached its absolute zenith in the early hours of September 30th, a night history remembers as the double event. The killer first struck Elizabeth Stride in Dutfield's yard. However, the operation was interrupted before any mutilation could occur, leaving only a severed throat. Forced to flee, the carriage moved deeper into the night. The conspirators could not leave their macabre quota unfulfilled. Less than an hour later, they located Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. Because the killers had time and privacy in the dark corners of the square, the full terrifying scope of Lord Randolph's alleged plan was finally unleashed. Catherine Eddowes was subjected to injuries so specific and so theatrical that they fundamentally altered the course of the investigation. Her abdomen was ripped open, her intestines were drawn out and deliberately draped over her right shoulder. Her face was systematically mutilated. Her left kidney was removed alongside her uterus. Why such extreme methodical butchery? The conspiracy narrative argues that these injuries were not random acts of psychopathy, but strict adherence to secret, ancient protocols. Both Lord Randolph Churchill and Sir William Gull were high-ranking members of the Freemasons. Within the secretive rites of this brotherhood, members swear extreme oaths of silence, bound by symbolic penalties. According to Masonic lore, the penalty for an entered apprentice revealing secrets is to have his throat cut across. For a fellow craft, it is to have his left breast torn open and his heart removed. For a master mason, it is to have his bowels taken out and burned. The theory posits that the Whitechapel murders were designed to mimic these exact ritualistic penalties. The bodies were left as a terrifying, bloody billboard directed at any other individuals in the underworld who might hold the crown's secrets. It was a message that the establishment would enforce its silence with absolute, ritualized annihilation. The events following the murder of Catherine Eddowes provide some of the most compelling, albeit highly debated circumstantial evidence of a high-level cover-up. As police searched the area surrounding Mitre Square, a constable discovered a piece of Eddowes' blood-soaked apron resting beneath an archway in Goulston Street. Above the apron, written in white chalk on the black brick wall, was a cryptic message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." In standard police procedure, physical evidence at a crime scene is rigorously protected until it can be photographed and analyzed. The Goulston Street graffito was the only direct communication potentially left the killer. Yet, when Sir Charles Warren, the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, arrived at the scene, he issued an unprecedented and baffling order. Before the police photographer could arrive, Warren commanded that the chalk writing be immediately washed away with a sponge. Warren publicly justified this destruction of evidence by claiming the message was anti-Semitic and that leaving it on the wall would spark violent riots against the Jewish population in the East End. However, investigators looking through the lens of the Churchill-Gull theory point to a completely different motive. Sir Charles Warren was not merely a police commissioner, he was also a highly prominent Freemason. In Masonic legend, the foundational architects of Solomon's Temple were murdered by three ruffians named Jubela, Jubelo, and Jubelum. Collectively, these three traitors are sometimes referred to in Masonic esoterica as the Jews. The theory argues that Warren recognized the graffito not as a racial slur, but as a deliberate Masonic signature left by the operatives working under Lord Randolph Churchill's Shadow Council. By ordering the message erased, Warren was allegedly acting on his higher loyalty to the Brotherhood and the establishment. He was blindfolding his own police force to protect the crown. The investigative jurisdictions were already clashing. Mitre Square fell under the City of London Police, while Goulston Street was metropolitan territory. Warren utilized his supreme authority to obliterate the evidence before rival detectives could fully comprehend its significance. The perfect crime was actively being shielded by the very authorities sworn to solve it. The campaign of silence reached its brutal conclusion on November 9th, 1888. The final target was Mary Jane Kelly, a woman believed to be the central figure holding the evidence of the secret royal marriage. Unlike the previous victims, she was murdered indoors inside her small rented room at 13 Miller's Court. Afforded hours of uninterrupted privacy, the killer engaged in the total systematic destruction of the human body. The physical evidence of the scene was so horrifying that veteran police officers were physically sickened upon entry. Mary Jane Kelly was essentially disassembled, and in a final terrifying nod to the alleged Masonic penalties, her heart was completely severed and removed from the crime scene. It was never found. With the death of Mary Jane Kelly, the Whitechapel murders abruptly stopped. Mainstream history struggles to explain why a serial killer at the peak of his bloodlust would simply vanish. But the royal conspiracy theory offers a cold, logical conclusion. The killing stopped because the operation was complete. The blackmailers were dead. The secret of Prince Eddie's indiscretion was permanently buried under a mountain of mutilated flesh. Lord Randolph Churchill's Shadow Council had successfully executed its objective. The crown was secure, the police had been successfully manipulated, and the phantom known as Jack the Ripper faded into the London fog. But orchestrating such absolute darkness exacts a price. While Lord Randolph Churchill had successfully protected the British monarchy, he could not protect himself from the biological time bomb ticking inside his own skull. The disease that had stripped him of his morality to authorize the Whitechapel slaughter was now preparing to claim his mind entirely. The architect of the terror was about to face a deeply humiliating, highly public destruction. The abrupt cessation of the Whitechapel murders in late November 1888 left the British public in a state of suspended terror. The East End of London braced for the next slaughter, but it never came. The phantom killer had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. For the destitute women of the slums, the nightmare eventually faded into a lingering cold dread. But for the men occupying the highest seats of power in Westminster, the silence from Whitechapel B wrought an immense collective relief. The threat of blackmail was eradicated. The secret of Prince Eddie's alleged illegitimate child was buried beneath the horrific headlines of a serial killer. The British monarchy had survived the crisis intact. If the conspiracy theory holds true, Lord Randolph Churchill had successfully executed a flawless, ruthless political maneuver. He had utilized the machinery of the state to commit the perfect crime. However, no amount of political genius or aristocratic privilege can negotiate with biology. Lord Randolph had outmaneuvered the Metropolitan Police, the press, and the criminal underworld, but he could not outrun the microscopic bacteria multiplying within his own central nervous system. The neurosyphilis that had allegedly eroded his moral boundaries and fueled his megalomania during the autumn of 1888 was now entering its terminal phase. The medical term of the era was general paralysis of the insane. It is a clinical description that fails to capture the profound horror of the physical and psychological collapse it entails. By the early 1890s, the brilliant razor-sharp intellect that had once dominated the British Empire began to visibly disintegrate. Treponema pallidum, the bacterium responsible for syphilis, systematically destroys the myelin sheath protecting the nerves. It eats through the frontal lobe of the brain. The decline is not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing public spectacle. Lord Randolph Churchill was renowned as the greatest orator of his generation. He possessed a photographic memory and an ability to dismantle political opponents with devastating, articulate precision. The House of Commons, a notoriously loud and aggressive chamber, would regularly fall silent just to hear him speak. But as the 1890s progressed, the chamber fell silent for an entirely different reason. They fell silent out of profound embarrassment and pity. The physical symptoms became impossible to hide. Lord Randolph developed severe ataxia, a lack of voluntary muscle coordination. His hands trembled violently. His once commanding voice deteriorated into a slurred, thick mumble. Historical records from his colleagues paint a devastating picture of a man entirely losing his grip on reality. He would stand at the dispatch box to deliver highly anticipated speeches on economic policy or foreign affairs. For a few minutes, the old brilliance would flicker. Then, the neurological damage would assert itself. He would lose his train of thought entirely. He would stare blankly at his own notes, unable to comprehend the words he had written. He would frequently mispronounce basic terms, repeat sentences endlessly, or simply stand in aggressive, confused silence. Worse than the memory loss were the violent paranoid outbursts. The megalomania induced by the disease convinced him that he was surrounded by conspirators and traitors. He would erupt into sudden, screaming fits of rage at his closest allies. He alienated the political establishment that had once revered him. The man who was once tipped to be the next prime minister became a political pariah, a ghost haunting the corridors of Westminster. The Victorian aristocracy operated on a strict code of silence regarding personal scandal. Everyone in the upper echelons of society, from the medical establishment to the political elite, knew exactly what was destroying Lord Randolph. Syphilis was the open secret of the era, yet no one dared speak the truth aloud. They watched the architect of their political landscape rot in plain sight, offering only averted eyes and polite, empty condolences. His estranged wife, Jenny Jerome, despite the years of cold separation and mutual resentment, was forced to step in and manage the catastrophe. The family desperately needed to remove him from the public eye before he caused irreparable damage to the Churchill legacy. In 1894, under the guise of seeking a cure and resting his nerves, the family organized a grand world tour. It was a thinly veiled attempt at medical exile. The journey was an absolute disaster. Removed from the familiar structures of London, Lord Randolph's condition rapidly accelerated. His behavior became wildly erratic and uncontrollable. He suffered from severe hallucinations. Accounts from the journey suggest he required constant restraint and medical supervision. The world tour was aborted. In late 1894, Lord Randolph Churchill was brought back to England. He was 45 years old, but his body and mind resembled that of a frail, dying octogenarian. He was completely bedridden, suffering from total paralysis and entirely devoid of human comprehension. The political titan had been reduced to a vegetative state. On January 24, 1895, Lord Randolph Churchill died in his London home. His death immediately triggered the final mechanism of the establishment's defense, the official cover-up of his legacy. The British press, heavily influenced by the government and aristocratic networks, published glowing obituaries. They mourned the tragic premature loss of a brilliant statesman. The official cause of death released to the public was general paralysis and nervous exhaustion. The medical establishment carefully stripped the diagnosis of its syphilitic context. The narrative presented to the British people was that Lord Randolph had simply worked his brilliant mind to death in the service of the empire. The aristocratic omerta held firm. The family buried him with full honors. The secret of his devastating squalid disease was officially erased from the public record. And if the royal conspiracy theory is to be believed, the far darker secret of his involvement in the Whitechapel murders was buried right alongside him. The establishment had successfully protected its own, neutralizing the threat of Prince Eddie's indiscretions, and sanitizing the death of the man who allegedly orchestrated the bloody cover-up. The book on Lord Randolph Churchill was officially closed. The dark chapters were sealed, but secrets of that magnitude leave a paper trail. Private medical files, deeply personal correspondence, and the quiet testimonies of the physicians who attended him remained locked away in the Churchill family archives. They were explosive documents waiting in the dark, and they were waiting for a young man who was just beginning to forge his own path in the world. A young man who revered the public image of his father, but who would eventually inherit the terrifying reality of his father's files. That young man was Winston Churchill, Winston Leonard Spencer. Churchill was 20 years old when his father died. He had spent his entire life desperately seeking the approval of a man who viewed him with cold indifference. Lord Randolph had rarely written to his son, and when he did, the letters were often filled with harsh criticism, predicting that Winston would become a useless, impoverished failure. Despite this emotional starvation, Winston worshipped his father. He viewed Lord Randolph not as a flawed human being, but as a political titan, a colossus who had been tragically cut down in his prime by sheer exhaustion. This idealized image was the psychological foundation upon which Winston built his own towering ambition. He was driven by a frantic, consuming need to vindicate the Churchill name, to succeed where his father had failed, and to finally earn the approval of a ghost. To achieve this, Winston needed to control the narrative. In 1906, after years of meticulous research and writing, he published a massive 2-volume biography titled Lord Randolph Churchill. It was hailed as a masterpiece of political biography. It cemented Lord Randolph's legacy as a brilliant, orthodox, conservative statesman. But biographies are defined as much by what they omit as by what they include. In writing his father's life, Winston Churchill gained exclusive access to the family's most guarded archives. He became the sole gatekeeper of his father's history. And it was within these private archives, surrounded by decades of locked correspondence, financial ledgers, and physicians' notes, that Winston allegedly came face to face with the devastating reality of his father's hidden life. Many historical researchers point out that Winston's biography of his father completely sanitizes Lord Randolph's final years. There is no mention of the erratic behavior, the violent paranoia, or the humiliating physical collapse. The official diagnosis of syphilis, widely known among the aristocratic elite and the medical establishment, is entirely erased from Winston's text. This erasure was not merely an act of filial piety. It was an act of extreme political survival. In the rigidly moralistic society of early 20th century Britain, acknowledging that the Chancellor of the Exchequer had died of a venereal disease and contracted in the London underworld would have been ruinous. It would have permanently stained the Churchill name, effectively destroying Winston's own political aspirations before they even began. But the conspiracy theory surrounding the Whitechapel murders introduces a far more dangerous element to these archives. If Lord Randolph Churchill was indeed the architect of the cover-up, as the theory suggests, the evidence would not have been found in official government files. A shadow council operates entirely off the books. The evidence, if it existed, would reside in highly confidential private correspondence. It would exist in coded letters between Lord Randolph and Sir William Gull, or in frantic classified dispatches from the Chief of Police, Sir Charles Warren. Did Winston Churchill uncover these documents? Did he find the paper trail linking his revered father to the ritualistic slaughter of 5 women in the East End? There is no definitive proof, precisely because of the actions Winston is alleged to have taken next. But we must examine the circumstantial evidence of his lifelong behavior regarding his father's medical history. Throughout his life, Winston Churchill suffered from severe, debilitating bouts of depression. He famously referred to this condition as his black dog. While modern psychology recognizes this as clinical depression, we must view it through the lens of early 20th century medical understanding. At the time, the mechanics of heredity and mental illness were poorly understood and deeply feared. Some biographers suggest that Winston carried a profound secret terror that he had inherited his father's madness. He was intensely aware of congenital syphilis. He watched his father's brain disintegrate, and he lived in constant fear that the same biological time bomb was ticking within his own mind. This fear drove his relentless manic work ethic. He had to achieve greatness quickly before the madness could take hold. This deep psychological terror would have made any physical evidence of his father's disease absolutely intolerable to him. The medical files were not just historical documents, they were a mirror reflecting his own worst nightmare. As Winston Churchill rose through the ranks of British politics, eventually becoming Prime Minister during the nation's darkest hour, his power to control history became absolute. He understood better than anyone the mechanics of legacy. He famously stated that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it. He applied this philosophy ruthlessly to his own family. According to historians who have scoured the Churchill archives, a highly suspicious void exists regarding Lord Randolph's medical records. While the archives contain exhaustive documentation of nearly every other aspect of the family's history, the clinical notes detailing Lord Randolph's final years, the specific treatments administered, and the private correspondence with his physicians are entirely missing. As the sole gatekeeper of his father's archives, Winston Churchill authored a sanitized legacy. The clinical notes detailing Lord Randolph, LPH's final years, vanished. Conspiracy theorists posit this was no accident. By purging these records, Winston didn't just hide a squalid venereal disease. He potentially incinerated the only paper trail linking his father to the Whitechapel slaughter, ensuring the phantom of Jack the Ripper would distract the world forever. The flames in Winston Churchill's study may have consumed the physical evidence of his father's medical collapse, but they could not incinerate the questions that continued to haunt the margins of British history. For nearly a century, the official narrative remained intact. Lord Randolph Churchill was remembered as a tragic political genius. Jack the Ripper was remembered as a lone, deranged phantom of the slums. The two worlds were kept entirely separate, sealed by the strict boundaries of class and the passage of time. But history is rarely a closed book. It is a battlefield of memory, and in the latter half of the 20th century, the sealed vault of the Victorian establishment was blown entirely open. Ironically, this conspiracy theory was pieced together not in the East End alleys, but directly inside the British establishment by researchers and investigative journalists who began to notice massive, glaring anomalies in the official police files of 1888. In the 1970s, the narrative shifted radically with the publication of explosive claims by investigators like Stephen Knight. They looked past the traditional suspects, the local butchers, the wandering sailors, the impoverished immigrants, and pointed a direct accusing finger at the Crown, the Freemasons, and Lord Randolph Churchill. When this theory was first presented to the public, it caused absolute outrage. It was viewed not just as an alternative historical take, but as an act of treason against the memory of the British monarchy and the Churchill family. Mainstream historians and ripperologists immediately launched a fierce counteroffensive. They mobilized to dismantle the royal conspire, AC theory brick by brick. However, the flaws in the conspiracy narrative are significant and heavily documented. The primary defense of the establishment rests on the physical reality of the accused. Sir William Gull, the alleged royal executioner, was 71 years old in 1888. He had recently suffered a stroke. Mainstream historians argue it is a physical impossibility for a frail elderly physician to have traveled to the East End in the dead of night, subdued desperate women, executed profound anatomical mutilations in near total darkness, and escaped without a drop of blood on his carriage. Furthermore, the alibi of Prince Eddie, the catalyst for the entire alleged cover-up, has been rigorously defended. Court circulars and official royal logs place the prince hundreds of miles away in Scotland during some of the most brutal Whitechapel murders. The establishment argues that if the prince was not in London, the foundational motive for the blackmail, and thus the cover-up, entirely collapses. They argue that the Masonic connections are purely coincidental. They dismiss the Goulston Street graffito, the erased chalk message about the Jews, as a random act of anti-Semitic vandalism in a neighborhood heavily populated by Jewish immigrants. They assert that Sir Charles Warren erased it merely to prevent a localized race riot, not to protect a secret brotherhood of aristocratic assassins. From a purely evidentiary standpoint, the mainstream historical consensus firmly rejects the involvement of Lord Randolph Churchill and Sir William Gull. They categorize the royal conspiracy as a sensationalist fiction, a modern myth superimposed over a tragic, unsolved Victorian crime. Yet, despite the formidable weight of academic pushback, the theory refuses to die. It has survived decades of debunking, remaining the most famous and widely debated explanation for the Whitechapel murders. Why does this specific narrative hold such immense, enduring power? Why does the public instinct naively distrust the official historical record? The answer lies in the deep psychological scars left by the British class system. The theory survives because it speaks to a profound underlying truth about the mechanics of power, inequality, and the absolute vulnerability of the poor. Victorian London was a society built on savage inequality. The wealth of the British Empire was concentrated in the grand estates of the West End, while the labor that fueled that empire was exploited in the squalor of the East End. The residents of Whitechapel were not treated as citizens. They were treated as industrial waste. They were trapped in a cycle of starvation, disease, and brutal labor, entirely abandoned by the government that ruled them. The public looks at the unsolved murders of 1888 and sees a glaring contradiction. The Metropolitan Police was the most advanced law enforcement agency in the world. They possessed vast resources, thousands of beat cops, and a sophisticated intelligence network. How could they fail to catch a man who was butchering women in the open streets, often with mere minutes between the police patrols? To many, incompetence is not a sufficient answer. The failure was too absolute, the destruction of evidence too convenient, and the subsequent silence too deafening. The royal conspiracy theory provides a mechanism that explains this failure. It taps into the universal historical fear that the ruling class operates entirely above the law. It validates the suspicion that when the survival of the establishment is threatened, the lives of the working class are considered entirely expendable. Even if Sir William Gull did not hold the knife, and even if Lord Randolph Churchill did not issue the direct order, the theory represents a broader, undeniable historical reality. The Victorian establishment did possess the power to crush the lower classes without consequence. The aristocracy did live double lives, indulging in horrific vices while preaching moral purity. The government did routinely cover up the scandals of the elite to protect the status quo. The Whitechapel murders became a mirror reflecting the absolute corruption of unchecked power. The 5 women who were slaughtered, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were marginalized in life, but their violent deaths threatened to expose the rotting foundation of the empire. When researchers delve into the missing police files, the destroyed medical records, and the sudden resignations of key police officials following the murders, they are not just looking for a killer. They are looking for the fingerprint of the state. They are investigating the machinery of the cover-up itself. The debate over Lord Randolph Churchill's involvement is a debate about the nature of historical truth. Are we to blindly accept the polished, sanitized narratives constructed by the families of the powerful? Or are we obligated to question the empty spaces in the archives, the burned documents, and the extraordinary lengths to which the establishment will go to protect its most prominent sons? This ongoing controversy forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice is rarely blind. In the dark alleys of 1888, justice was allegedly blindfolded by the very men sworn to uphold it. And as the 20th century dawned, the consequences of this supreme act of aristocratic arrogance would begin to ripple outward, shaping the legacy of the Churchill family and the cultural memory of the modern world. The creation of the Jack the Ripper myth was not an accident. If the royal conspiracy theory is accurate, the myth was a carefully constructed state-sponsored distraction. The establishment actively manipulated the public mind to complete Lord Randolph Churchill's alleged cover-up. When a government needs to hide a crime committed by the elite, it does not simply erase the evidence. Erasure leaves a void, and voids invite questions. Instead, a impetent government creates a louder, more terrifying narrative to fill that space. The British establishment needed the public to look away from Buckingham Palace and the House of Commons. They needed a boogeyman. They found it in the concept of a lone, deranged serial killer. The Metropolitan Police and the complicit Victorian press fed this narrative with relentless efficiency. The newspapers of the 1880s were owned and operated by the same aristocratic class that Lord Randolph Churchill belonged to. They understood their role in protecting the empire. Rather than investigating the glaring anomalies in the police response, the press published sensationalist, blood-soaked stories about a phantom roaming the slums. They printed the infamous Dear Boss and From Hell letters, cementing the name Jack the Ripper into the global consciousness. This media circus served a vital political purpose. It isolated the violence. It told the British public that the threat was a localized aberration, a single monster hiding in the fog. rather than a systemic rot at the very top of their society. It shifted the blame entirely from the gilded palaces to the filthy gutters. The success of this distraction had devastating consequences for the victims. Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. In life, the empire starved them. In death, the empire erased their humanity. They were stripped of their personal histories and reduced to mere props in a grand Victorian melodrama. They became famous not as women who were brutally silenced by the state, but as the unfortunate prey of a mythical madman. Their graves were largely unmarked and forgotten, while the men accused of orchestrating their slaughter were buried under marble monuments with the full honors of the British Empire. This profound injustice forces us to re-examine the political education of Winston Churchill. The young Winston watched his father's agonizing decline, and he eventually inherited the heavy burden of the Churchill family secrets. We must ask how this dark inheritance shaped the worldview of the man who would lead Britain through its darkest hour. Winston Churchill is celebrated for his unyielding resolve and his capacity to make ruthlessly pragmatic decisions during World War II. He was a leader who understood that the survival of the state sometimes requires actions that are morally indefensible in times of peace. Where did he learn this cold, calculating pragmatism? Psychological historians argue that Winston's understanding of power was forged in the shadow of his father's hidden life. If Winston discovered the truth about Whitechapel in those private medical files before he burned them, he learned a terrifying lesson about the mechanics of statecraft. He learned that the establishment survives by committing necessary evils and burying them deep underground. He learned that history does not reward moral purity, it rewards survival. The fire he used to destroy his father's medical records was fueled by the exact same philosophy that allowed him to authorize the devastating bombing campaigns of the 1940s. He understood that to protect the realm, you must sometimes employ the tactics of the devil. The alleged Whitechapel cover-up was not just a Victorian scandal. It was a blueprint for modern state secrecy. It demonstrated that a government armed with loyal intelligence networks and a compliant press could execute its own citizens and completely control the historical aftermath. It proved that the law is not a universal shield, but a flexible tool wielded by those who hold the levers of power. This is why the official files regarding the Whitechapel murders remain a heavily contested battleground even today. In the decades following the crimes, crucial police documents, medical reports, and internal memos inexplicably vanished from the National Archives. Scotland Yard claimed these files were lost, stolen by souvenir hunters, or destroyed in the Blitz. But investigators who study the deep state recognize a familiar pattern. Files regarding Jack the Ripper disappeared with the same exact precision as Lord Randolph Churchill's medical records. The sheer volume of missing evidence points to a systematic, prolonged effort by the British government to maintain the blindfold. Even generations later, the establishment instinctively protects its institutional integrity, admitting that a Chancellor of the Exchequer, a royal physician, and a police commissioner conspired to mutilate 5 women to protect a reckless prince would require a total dismantling of the British historical identity. It would require admitting that the foundation of the modern monarchy is stained with the blood of innocent, impoverished women. No government willingly commits historical suicide. Therefore, the official narrative must be enforced. The police files must remain incomplete. The myth of the lone madman must be perpetuated. The structural inequality of the Victorian era must be written off as a tragic flaw of the past rather than the active weapon it was, but the silence is cracking. As forensic technology advances and independent researchers refuse to accept the official historical boundaries, the Shadow Council of 1888 is slowly being dragged into the light. The aristocratic immunity that protected Lord Randolph Churchill in his lifetime cannot protect him from the relentless scrutiny of the modern age. The fog of Whitechapel is lifting, revealing the cold mechanical reality of an empire that ate its own people to survive. The legacy of 1888 did not end when the blood was washed from the cobblestones of Whitechapel. It did not end when Lord Randolph Churchill drew his final agonizing breath in 1895, his mind entirely devoured by neurosyphilis. Nor did it end when his son Winston Churchill allegedly consigned the damning medical evidence to the flames decades later. The consequences of these events bled deeply into the twentieth century, permanently altering the relationship between the British public and the ruling establishment. The profound historical significance of this narrative is etched into the physical landscape of modern London. Walk through Parliament Square today, you will see towering bronze statues of the statesmen who forged the empire. You will see Winston Churchill cast in solid metal, staring defiantly across the centuries. These monuments project an image of unshakable morality, duty, and sacrifice. Now take a short journey eastward to Whitechapel. There are no grand monuments for Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, or Mary Jane Kelly. Instead, the streets where they were systematically dismantled have been transformed into a macabre theater. Every night, crowds of tourists follow guides who recount the gruesome details of their murders, searching for the phantom called Jack the Ripper. The victims have been reduced to mere props in a commercialized ghost story. This stark contrast reveals the ultimate lasting victory of the alleged royal conspiracy. The establishment did not merely cover up a crime, they successfully commodified the tragedy. By creating the myth of the lone supernatural serial killer, the state ensured that the public would spend the next century looking in the wrong direction. The victims were denied justice in life, and they have been denied dignity in death. They are remembered only for the brutal manner in which they were torn apart, while the men accused of orchestrating their destruction are immortalized in bronze. However, the blood spilled in Whitechapel inadvertently triggered a massive sociological earthquake that the Crown never intended. For decades, social reformers and socialist politicians had campaigned tirelessly to draw attention to the horrific poverty of the East End. They had written reports, organized strikes, and pleaded with Parliament to address the starvation and disease rampant in the slums. The political establishment, led by men like Lord Randolph Churchill, had largely ignored them. The East End was out of sight and therefore entirely out of mind. But the sheer theatrical brutality of the murders in the autumn of 1888 forced a change. The establishment could ignore poverty, but they could not ignore the national panic generated by the press. The relentless newspaper coverage of the crimes shone a blinding, unforgiving light on the squalor of Whitechapel. For the first time, wealthy Londoners sitting in their Mayfair drawing rooms were forced to confront the reality of how the other half lived. They read about women who were forced to sell themselves for the price of a stale loaf of bread, women who slept in doorways because they could not afford 4 pence for a bed in a crowded lodging house. The murders accomplished what years of political lobbying could not. They shamed the British Empire. The intense public scrutiny surrounding the crimes accelerated the first genuine waves of social reform in London. Philanthropists flooded the East End. The worst of the slum housing, like the notorious old Nickel Rookery, was eventually cleared and replaced by the first social housing projects. In a bitter historical irony, the desperate women who were allegedly slaughtered to protect the crown became the ultimate catalysts for improving the lives of the working class. Their violent deaths forced the empire to clean up its own backyard. Yet this social progress cannot erase the chilling implications of how the state operates in times of crisis. The conspiracy theory surrounding Lord Randolph Churchill serves as a foundational blueprint for understanding modern governmental secrecy. If we accept the premise that the highest ranks of the British government conspired to execute 5 citizens to protect the monarchy and then successfully manipulated the police, the medical establishment, and the press to cover it up, we must confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. We must acknowledge that the concept of the establishment is not a political abstraction. It is a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient survival mechanism. The mechanics of the 1888 cover-up did not die with the Victorian era. The strategies allegedly utilized by Lord Randolph Churchill, compartmentalizing information, leveraging secret brotherhoods, destroying physical evidence, and feeding the press a sensationalist counter-narrative, have been echoed in state scandals throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. From the suppression of the Profumo affair in the 1960s to modern crises involving powerful individuals evading justice, the public consistently recognizes the same pattern. The elite protect the elite. The law is rigidly enforced upon the poor, but it becomes entirely pliable when applied to the powerful. The Whitechapel conspiracy resonates today because it validates our deepest, most cynical suspicions about the true nature of power. The character of Lord Randolph Churchill remains a study in paradox. If the theory holds true, he was both a perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty and a victim of biology. He was a man who possessed one of the greatest political minds of his generation. He understood the complex machinery of global economics and imperial strategy. But that brilliant mind was invaded by a microscopic bacterium. The syphilis that ravaged his brain did not care about his aristocratic lineage or his political titles. It slowly stripped him of his humanity, his reason, and his dignity. The tragedy of Lord Randolph Churchill is the terrifying realization that human morality is fragile, heavily dependent on the physical integrity of the brain. When disease eroded his neurological boundaries, the megalomania took over, convincing him that he was a god who could authorize slaughter to maintain the political order. His final years were a living purgatory. The man who allegedly ordered the mutilation of women in the dark died a slow, humiliating death in the light, unable to control his own limbs, unable to speak, trapped inside a rotting biological shell. It was a brutal, karmic retribution delivered not by the justice system, but by nature itself. And what of the son who inherited this devastating legacy? Winston Churchill lived a life defined by monumental historical events. He led a nation through the fire of the Blitz. He stared down the threat of fascism, and he solidified his place as one of the most revered figures in world history. He was a man of supreme courage and unyielding public resolve, but historians and biographers have long noted the deep, brooding silence that often surrounded him in his private moments. He suffered from profound bouts of depression. He drank heavily. He pushed himself to the brink of physical exhaustion. We must ask how much of this internal torment was fueled by the secrets he carried. If Winston Churchill sat in his study and deliberately burned the medical records proving his father's syphilis, and perhaps his father's involvement in the greatest cover-up in royal history, he committed an act of supreme historical vandalism. He chose family legacy over historical truth. He chose to protect the myth of the great British statesman, knowing full well that this myth was built over the unquiet graves of 5 murdered women. He understood that history is not an objective record of facts. History is a narrative written by those who survive, by those who hold the pen, and by those who control the archives. Winston chose to write a history where the Churchills were the undisputed heroes of the British Empire, but the truth is remarkably resilient. It is like water. It finds the cracks in the masonry. It seeps through the burned ledgers, the missing police files, and the official denials. The persistent survival of the royal conspiracy theory proves that the public intuition is sharp. We instinctively know when a story is incomplete. We know when a government is lying to you. As time moves forward, the untouchable statues of the Victorian era are slowly losing their luster. Modern society is increasingly willing to look past the grand narratives of empire and examine the human cost of that power. The aristocratic immunity that protected Lord Randolph Churchill in his lifetime is entirely useless against the relentless scrutiny of historical hindsight. We are left with a story of absolute power, biological decay, and the desperate lengths to which a family and a nation will go to protect their image. It is a story that forces us to question the foundations of our historical heroes and recognize the brutal compromises that often lie beneath the surface of civilization. The flames in Winston Churchill's study may have consumed the physical evidence, but the void left in the archives forces a darker reckoning. When the powerful dictate the truth and the evidence turns to ash, how do we distinguish between the heroes who saved a nation and the monsters who ruled it in the dark?